Please help me welcome Jonathan Greenblatt to the stage.
So first of all, it's not often you get to follow not only a former Speaker of the House, but sort of a legendary politician and a real leader. So it's a privilege, really, to be here. And Carrie and Don and all of you, thank you so much for having me. I'm really just delighted. So as Carrie said, I run the Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation at the White House. I don't know how many of you have actually, except for John Gompertz, how many had heard of that before I came here? You, Carol, you can't raise your hand either. Okay. So there are a few, there are like 4 or 5 of you. Well, so it's interesting what the speaker talked about, because I'm also going to talk a little bit about leadership and about this idea of sort of laying the cornerstone. So I got a call in summer of 2011 from the West Wing, because the president wanted to take this office of social innovation, and he wanted to bring social entrepreneurship directly into the Oval in order to accelerate progress in his priorities, and to think differently about how we do policy development. You know, I've had some experience, as Carrie was mentioning, starting and scaling companies, building brands that are about trying not only make money and drive margin, but also be meaningful and make a difference. And so, you know, I think over the last 3 years, we've had some important wins. We've come up with some interesting strategies to expand national service through partnerships that, you know, strengthen our communities and at the same time help create pathways for young people like FEMA Corps. We've thought a little bit about using new tools like impact investing or social impact bonds or innovation funds through partners like venture philanthropy partners, and Carol Thompson-Cole has been a great friend in that work, to break down barriers and access the trillions of dollars that are in the markets today that we want to put toward and direct toward strengthening communities. We've, you know, organized resources and kickstarted new models like the My Brother's Keeper initiative to focus on alleviating the conditions that keep back boys and young men of color. And I think actually MBK might end up being, and we can talk about this later, Carrie, one of the most interesting legacies of this administration when all is said and done. But so after 3 years, while I'm proud of our accomplishments, I think what I realize is that it's not really enough in many respects. That is to say, it's a bit like fixing the leaks in your, trying to fix leaks in the pipes under your house. Here and there, we actually need to refit the entire structure. And I think in some ways that's where we are. We've got this aging, sort of creaking infrastructure, and there's work to be done to create the kind of systems that, and to recreate and to strengthen the systems that made the country great. You know, I think they were envisioned maybe in a younger time when we think about when, let's say, the national railways were built that connect the country. And maybe some might say it was a more hopeful time, but we shouldn't kid ourselves, right? Like the politics were toxic then. There was political stalemates then. There were interest groups then. So we memorialize when in fact, what we need to do is, I think, learn lessons from those times and apply them to today. And so whether it was building our interstate railway system, or whether it was thinking about national parks, or whether it was thinking about how we would power our growing economy, you know, none of these were perfect. There were issues. There were issues when you think about how we built, like the Hoover Dam. There were challenges. There were environmental challenges. There were community challenges. There were political challenges. And yet we had the will to get it done. And so I think, although there were issues, we found ways, and I think we need to go back to that today. Because in the way that those systems enabled the flow of goods, or enabled, again, power, and enabled the country to grow, we can do those things again. And by the way, those systems, building big national systems, laying cornerstones, if you will, it required leadership. And you know what? It's not unique to 100 years ago. I mean, it's happened more recently. So think about this man. Anyone recognize this person? This is the kind of room where I think some people might. His name was John Gardner. So he was a decorated vet. He was the head of the Carnegie Corporation in New York, and he was impressed into public service by LBJ, who brought him down to head up the old Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, where this man created Medicare to strengthen the safety net, where this man took the issue of the elderly who didn't have the services that they needed and built a system that today, I mean, is a bedrock of our healthcare system and what we think of as our safety net. John Gardner did. Oh, by the way, he did that, and he did other things too. I mean, he went on to create the public broadcasting system. He went on to create Common Cause, and he went on to create the independent sector, which I think many in this room are probably very familiar with. So, and it didn't only happen at the federal level. We've built systems to address, in recent times, more local challenges. So it's not that long ago when New York City suffered from massive overcrowding and bad sort of urban design and real challenges with housing. And this led them to think about how could they organize housing to deal with it. And this man, Robert Moses, who in many ways has been kicked around a lot, I think, in recent years, but he was the urban planner who spent 30 years, basically, in public service in New York and really reshaped the city. He is the one responsible for helping to tackle affordable housing, building out Long Island, creating the highway system that links the city today and makes Manhattan the most vibrant source of commerce and capital in the world. So I think the president shares this ambition too. I mean, I must say, part of the reason why I feel confident about where we're going is because of the fact that our president has made big, bold bets. And our president also thinks about systems. But I'll tell you, we need more people to take these kinds of big bets. We need more leaders. I hope, like many of the people in this room, people who will think about, if you will, oops, sorry, I'm a little bit disjointed up here, but really building the scaffolding of these new systems. So what does that look like? Well, I'll give you a couple thoughts on what I think it looks like. I think leaders need to, number one, and that's why I wanted to talk about this today, they need to understand policy. Policy is really fundamental. It's not about building a website, right? It's about creating a global internet naming system that allows many websites to be built, to people work across political lines, time zones, et cetera. Policy really matters to create long-term fundamental change, to create systems. And I say that as a social entrepreneur who appreciates how you can build rifle shots here and there, but you really need sort of bigger systems to tackle big problems. Number two, they require commitment. Commitment's really important. They take time. They don't happen overnight. They don't necessarily fit into a neat political cycle. They're complex. They require innovation. You have to see things differently, and you need this cross-sector, interdisciplinary approach. And I would say that they need to be anchored in enlightened public interest. And what I mean by that is they can be market-informed, but they can't entirely be market-driven. They need to adapt from the private sector, but they can't only be about private interest. We need to think about a more enlightened approach. And again, as I said before, they need to be integrated, but I don't just mean interdisciplinary. I mean they need to be hardware and software. We need atoms and bits. The answers aren't on Twitter. You know, I think we kind of fetishize social media as being the strategy of everything. That's not exactly the case. We need integrated approaches. And so to summarize, I think what we really need is this new breed of public servant who's prepared to wage a sustained campaign over years, not just a single petition. Change.org isn't, throw up a couple signatures there on We the People. That's not enough. We need to think to tackle the big issues we're facing these days, the scary problems that could be civilizational in impact and could have consequences on our entire culture if we don't get them right. We really need someone who can think about, not a new app, as I'm saying, not someone who's ready to build a new Chrome extension or run some Kickstarter campaign. Although those are all nice and novel, they're not enough. We need people who are thinking about architecture. We need people who are thinking about welding together the systems that we'll require to move forward. And so, it's almost like this approach, right? It's a degree of long-termism, you could almost say. The general who understands that this isn't going to be a scattershot skirmish. This is going to be a long-term approach. People with the stick-to-itiveness to oversee an ongoing mission. And so I would also note that, and again, Carrie, this is right up your alley, that we are starting to see this change. We're starting to see it at the local level in cities as people are self-organizing through models like philanthropy and collective action. We're starting to see it here in the government through our U.S. Digital Service, through the work that the remarkable Dan Tangerlini is doing very quietly at GSA. We're starting to see it through other programs like, goodness, this clicker's really crazy, through Fuse Corps or through City Hall Fellows, where they're bringing talented people into public service, much like the way LBJ once brought John Gardner into service, 30 some odd years ago. So what do we need? We need people who are really ready to build, not just fix a bug, but to build a whole new operating system. to lay the new cornerstones that we need for an impact economy and the society that we want to see. Thank you. Okay.
That one, actually. Okay. Well, thank you again for being here on a busy, very busy day for you. So we're going to try to just get through a couple of questions within about 10 minutes. Okay. So Jonathan and I actually have a relationship from many years back, and it's been interesting to watch you over the years and finally to come into this role, and you have done so much for this office. I want to actually lead with a question about the characteristics of leaders. And what we're going to do is come back to a comment that you just made about the leaders and their commitment to service. So you and I share a relationship with Peter Diamandis of the X Prize Foundation. And he has been known to say on more than one occasion, today's crazy idea is tomorrow's brilliant idea. Yeah. And I know that you share that notion as well. And
for those who don't know, Peter recently founded a company that's mining asteroids for precious minerals.
Right. Crazy, but brilliant. So as a leader, he has been able to move some pretty big, unthinkable missions forward, as have you. And you, now in your current position, are seeing leaders from across sectors who are also moving missions forward through the Social Innovation Fund. So I want you to reflect for a minute on what you're seeing as you think about the innovative leaders out there. You know, what characteristics tie them together, and what can the people in this room learn and be thinking about what makes a leader effective in moving a mission?
That's a good question. So I think
Yes, thank you.
So I think some of the things that we're seeing relate back in many ways to the points that I put up a little bit earlier. I think the leaders of today, the best ones that we see, think in a very integrated basis. Again, and I should just point out right up front, Carrie, it's kind of you to compare me to Peter Diamandis. I don't know if I deserve that comparison. He is an extraordinary individual. With that said, a little bit like Peter, they think in systems. So they might want to launch a venture here, but they're thinking at a degree of scale. Number two, like Peter, they have a degree of stick-to-itiveness. Peter's been at this now for 20 years.
Right.
So he's, the classic overnight success story that's been doing it for a very long time. And so they are mission-oriented, but meaningfully focused on the long term. I think number three, they really do understand complexity. Like, these are not simple problems, and it's at the risk of oversimplifying, you need an ability to play that three-dimensional chess game so you understand that these are multidisciplinary solutions to try to tackle. Right. So those are some of the traits I think we're seeing in some of the most effective social entrepreneurs and social innovators. The kind of people that Carol is funding through VPP, the kind of people who, again, through programs like the Social Innovation Fund, are taking really interesting strategies to scale.
Cool. Okay, good. I want to ask you for a second a question that's come up from many people in this audience, and they're interested to get your take on this. So in recent years, and you've mentioned them, a new crop of social entrepreneurs have risen up in a new way, right? Building businesses by doing well by doing good. And they always talk about Tom Shoes as the example here. So how then does a 40, 50, or 100-year-old nonprofit traditional organization compete, perhaps, or pivot to be able to make that same kind of impact or buzz in driving a mission forward?
So I'm thinking a lot about that these days. So how does a 100-year-old nonprofit organization take advantage of strategies of sort of social innovation? I think I hate to quote the president, yes, we can, right? What I mean by that is I think there's lots of opportunities to learn lessons from those small organizations, but organizations with capital, with heritage, with reach, can do tremendous things by intrapreneuring in many ways. So I don't think we should necessarily chase, the new thing. I think there may be very interesting ways to learn from that, to adapt, and to adjust organizations to new operating realities.
And it's much more, I think what we were trying to get in the opening remarks today is that the strategy has to be part of it. It's not about trying to latch on to the latest gimmick, right? Because that's not going to work.
It's not about another, Chrome browser extension, or like, wow, we can run a social media campaign or a Kickstarter campaign. I mean, come on. Again, we need to think much more systematically and realize that what those tools are, for example, leveraging the crowd, engaging more effectively with your audience, bringing them into the kind of creative process, if you will. Those are tactics that can be leveraged in service of bigger strategies. But I would go so far as to say, we're living in a moment now where there's incredible clutter and there's lots of noise. I mean, the numbers just of like, there are 10 million tweets every hour, or something really just bizarre and baffling. I mean, you can't even really think in this scale. So I would go so far as to say nonprofits in particular, with again, capital, with heritage, with mission, with reach, those are great. Those can be great brands that are very well positioned to innovate and succeed in this environment. Now, they might not be the things that Carol is funding at VPP, but that's the point. She shouldn't be. But they may be able to draw capital from other places, like the Ford Foundation, more institutional investors, if you will, in ways that are very exciting.
Good. Okay. So I want to lead or end with systems and architecture and policy, which is where I know you wanted to go. So you've talked before, and in your TED Talk you talk about this, creating the role that government can be or can play in creating on-ramps to impact investing, incentivizing it, safeguarding it. So let's talk a little bit, and I want you to eventually get to the architecture and the systems, but where are we really with funding tools like social impact bonds and other pay-for-success financing options supported by this administration?
So I think that it's almost like what Ezra Klein would call a B-side, if you will. Some of the stuff that we've done more on the margins around financial innovation, as exemplified by models like Pay-for-Success, haven't gotten the attention of some of the other big administration initiatives, but I think they are incredibly exciting and have they have a very long runway. So there are roughly $50 million to $60 million worth of Pay-for-Success initiatives in play today all over the country. What's interesting is that some of those have used grants, our initial grants that we seeded from Departments of Labor and Department of Justice. And we held some initial convenings on this as far back as late 2011. But this is happening in cities and in counties and in states, despite the paralysis here in Washington. Because folks on the ground, mayors and county administrators and governors, as well as philanthropists, as well as kind of investors, because we have institutionals like Goldman and retail plays like B of A who are moving this forward because they see tremendous promise. Now, there are those people. I remember hearing a few years ago, someone said to me, do I think there's a social impact bubble? I was like, social impact bubble? There's been one of these so far in the United States. But I do think they suffer from a great deal of hype. And we need to manage expectations. This is not a silver bullet. This is not a panacea. And as I said earlier, I do not believe the market will solve all our problems. Period. And we should just sort of, that's a fiction that we shouldn't believe. On the other hand, I do believe that the public sector can learn a great deal from market-based models. And I think Pay-for-Success has tremendous promise. And I'll give you one indication that I do think people are coming around. So we proposed in our last two budgets to create a $300 million Pay-for-Success incentive fund at the Department of the Treasury to do credit enhancements, potentially to do outcome payments, to help get the field moving. Because what we've heard is that investors are concerned about the risk associated with this new, novel, and let's be fair, unproven tool. Again, it is not a silver bullet. Well, over the past 3 months, since back to June, maybe it's 4 months, we've seen bipartisan proposals in the House and the Senate that essentially duplicate our budget proposal. On the House side, from Representative Todd Young, who's Ways and Means, and Representative Delaney, who's from here in Maryland, who's got a background in finance. And on the Senate side, from Senator Bennett of Colorado and Senator Orrin Hatch from Utah, who, by the way, may have a different set of responsibilities in a few months. This is incredibly exciting. It's really, really neat to see R's and D's coming together on this. And it's in response to what's happening around the country. So I think that's a good example of a very promising tool that I think his best days are ahead of us. And I think there are lots of other models like this, like the innovation funds, like the new Impact SBIC program we just sort of opened up a couple weeks ago. These are all different models of impact investing, and they alone will not change the world. They alone will not solve all our problems, but they become a very exciting set of tools that we can add to our toolkit to finally try to tackle and get progress on tough, vexing local problems.